Spoiler warnings for Velma, but it's really bad, but fucking whatever, just spoilers for the whole thing.
I was actually contemplating if I should even talk about the rest of this show. I put my 2 cents in already, talking about how the first 2 episodes were god-awful and were a terrible first impression to an adult interpretation of a beloved children's show, and that was it. But at the same time, I had a little bit of morbid curiosity, so of course I just said,
fuck it!
I watched the entire show, all 10 goddamn episodes from start to finish, and unsurprisingly,
Fucking thing sucks!
Velma is what happens when a bunch of out-of-touch writers attempt to make an adult comedy, with some corporate executive mandating that the show has to be related to some pre-existing IP, and then actually make a show.
You know what 420 is, right?
Yeah. It's code for adults who still watch cartoons.
And yeah, of course, the whole thing was dreadful. Velma was nothing more than another adult animated comedy trying to ride the success of other shows that were actually good. Now, I'll get this out of the way. Is this the worst comedy I've ever seen? Simply put, no. There are much worse things than it. But at the same time, it is pretty god-awful. It's made all the worse since good adult animated comedy shows have been getting axed left and right. So for something like this to actually make it out of the concept phase is just infuriating. So I'm gonna go through all of the different aspects of this thing and explain why it's just downright bad. Starting with the plot of Velma revolves around Velma, as she and the rest of the cast try to solve the mystery of a serial killer who's been murdering girls at their high school. However, there seems to be a bit more to this situation, as it seems to be tied with the disappearance of Velma's mother, who has been missing for years. The show is serialized, with each episode leading into the next, with the main plot about the murders and subplots focusing on specific characters. Sort of. Velma has an issue with balancing all of its characters and plots, with some getting way more screen time than others, which really kills any momentum the narrative itself may have had. Because the show is trying to be comedy-driven and narrative-driven, which does not work here. Because the show wants to keep some kind of tension with the murders going on, but then at the same time kills any of that when someone makes a stupid-ass comment during serious moments.
If Norval could take a hint or read a signal, we wouldn't be stuck here like a 127 hours.
This is the most obnoxious thing I've ever experienced in my life.
The beginning of the show makes us aware that death is a real thing. 3 people are murdered and the whole town is freaking out about this, and it's constantly brought up that the murderer is still at large. However, the show isn't particularly good with trying to keep that suspense, because multiple times throughout it, there's tons of violence that absolutely ruins it. For example, this kid right here gets his leg chopped off in a somewhat comedic fashion, which already ruins the atmosphere. But it gets worse as there's visual gags where his leg falls off until about halfway into the show, where the kid is just perfectly fine and walking around as if nothing happened. The show wants to have its cake and eat it too. It wants to keep some form of suspense and mystery, but also wants to have hilarious jokes that can be as absurd as possible without worrying about consistency. Trying to be like Gravity Falls, but with swearing and violence. However, the difference between the two is the fact that Gravity Falls keeps its humor grounded in a way that wouldn't get in the way of the story or stakes, and the fact that a show aimed at children and teenagers has better writing than one that's supposed to be aimed towards adults is more embarrassing than anything else. And even when there's clues and pieces to the mystery being found, it feels unnatural. Like, for example, the only way the characters are able to figure out one of the most crucial pieces of information to progress the plot is when, well, firstly, this happens, which I got a lot of enjoyment from. Then leads to Velma being able to blackmail her principal for this.
No, not the dairy section! 2%, 1%, half and half!
Now, besides none of that being funny, except this is an absolute terrible way to progress the plot, since there were so many different circumstances that needed to have happened in order for this to even happen. Not to mention, practically no one likes Velma at all, so people would have called her out if she even tried to blackmail her principal. And even when massive things are revealed, like the murdered girls being brains in jars, or the reveal of who the killer is, it all feels hollow, because it's as if nothing mattered. Not to mention stupid. The funny thing is that even though Velma was basically making fun of the original material it came from and trying to distance itself from it as much as humanly possible, it probably could have taken a few things from it. Because if the show was episodic, dealing with different self-contained mysteries like the original shows, then it wouldn't have felt as dragged out as it is, and some of the absurdist comedy present could have worked. I mean, an adult version of Scooby-Doo doesn't sound that bad, honestly, but Velma tries to bite off more than it can chew, resulting in its narrative being lackluster and idiotic, which is made even worse by I hate literally every goddamn character in this show. Not a single one of them has a likable trait that makes them somewhat tolerable. They all sit on this spectrum of unlikability, with some not being as bad as others, and then others just being the worst. Shaggy, or Norville I guess, is a literal simp for Velma throughout the show. There's really no other discernible traits that he has, and what infuriates me about him is the fact that he gets trashed on by Velma 24/7 and doesn't stand up for himself until the penultimate episode, which made me go,
Yes! Yes! Yes!
but then he goes back to simping for her in the finale!
No! 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 Fuck!
He was the closest compared to everyone else to being a tolerable character, but his stupidity was so irritating to watch. Speaking of irritating stupidity, Fred is now a spoiled, idiotic child, who's supposed to be a total dumbass in a funny way, but unfortunately the writers forgot to add the funny. He's supposed to be the comedic relief of the show, being dumb but in a charismatic kind of way. However, his stupidity goes so overboard to the point where he's just annoying more than anything else. Mystery Inc. did this much better, where Fred was also not the brightest crayon in the coloring box, but it made up for that by having more personality beyond just being dumb. Plus, he was just way funnier.
Get a hold of yourself, Fred. Be a man. Keep repeating. You're dead inside. You're dead inside.
The character to have been butchered the least here, though, was Daphne, who, although was probably the most tolerable character next to Norville, she still wasn't great. Unlike everyone else besides Velma, Daphne actually has some more going on personally besides the main plot, since she has a subplot involving her discovering who her real parents are, but then that plot also goes literally nowhere and is then pointless in the end. But at the very least, I appreciated that the writers tried to give the tiniest amount of character development possible here. However, she's also a drug dealer, so of course there's that, but she's also the one to probably make the most insufferable meta jokes in the show, second to only one other. Which leads me to the star of the show herself, Velma, who is one of the most unlikable characters in fiction I have ever seen. She's an absolute dick to every character in the show, with the only things to come out of her mouth either being stuff related to the mystery, being a total dick to people, or meta humor. Or it's all three at the same time. I, for the life of me, do not understand how the writers looked at this dialogue and thought it was hilarious. It was almost as if they were in the middle of binge watching Rick and Morty and wanted to have a character like Rick in their show, but without realizing that Rick Sanchez as a character is written to be a cynical asshole that you're not really supposed to side with a lot. You can tell that the writers wanted her to be a rootable protagonist as well, and it just doesn't work. And it's also as if the show knows she's a massive asshole to people since she gets called out for it constantly. Like when she reads Daphne's diary openly to the whole school mocking her, and instead of laughing at Daphne, they boo Velma. And then she proceeds to get the shit rightfully beaten out of her. After that, there's really no other characters I can say were memorable in any way, either being good or bad. They're all either morons, assholes, or both. There's literally no in between. Though I will give a little tiny bit of credit to Gigi, since I actually thought she was alright and didn't irritate me like everyone else did, so there was that. But I find it hilarious that a side character that has very little screen time is 1,000 times better than any of the other characters. It's both hilarious and pathetic. Now, I'm no expert in comedy or a genius comedian, but what I can say is that this is one of the most painfully unfunny shows I have ever seen. Velma relies heavily and almost exclusively on meta humor. If the Rick and Morty comparisons weren't clear enough, you can absolutely tell that this is exactly what the writers were trying to go for. Because whenever characters get a chance, they will blurt out nonsense that doesn't fit the conversation or scenario they're currently in.
Exactly. I spit truth without a filter, like every comedian before #MeToo.
Like these kinds of comments don't fit within dialogue naturally. Sure, Rick does this kind of same thing, but he can at least be clever with his references sometimes.
Hey, you guys ever use that Thunderdome, or do you just put it up for decoration?
You mean the Blood Dome?
Save it for the Semantics Dome, E.B. White. Ooh, burn.
But every time someone makes some sort of comment here, more times than not, I'm just sitting in my seat wondering, was that supposed to be a joke?
Accused of a murder I didn't commit.
And whose fault is that?
Excuse me?
Don't you raise your eyebrows at me, Steve Harvey.
Like, legitimately, is that supposed to be funny? Or how about this one?
Extra drugs here. Narc. White girl with too much money. White girl with too much money.
Or how about this?
See, your dad is worse for teen mental health than waist trainers.
I really don't know what is supposed to be funny. Like, where is the joke? It gets even worse when the show is clearly trying to get the moments where Velma is a total dick to people to be humorous. But unlike a character like Rick Sanchez, who's also a nihilist, he can at least be witty with a lot of his insults.
Listen to your sister, Morty. To live is to risk it all. Otherwise, you're just an inert chunk of randomly assembled molecules drifting wherever the universe blows you. Oh, I'm sorry, Jerry. I didn't see you there. How much of that did you hear?
All of it. You were looking right at me.
Also again, Rick is intentionally written to be a dick. Velma just says something really mean to someone without anything else being clever. So instead of her being a clever asshole, she's just a pretentious asshole. But after that, that's pretty much it. That's all the kinds of comedy here. Any other forms of jokes that may be present here are completely overshadowed by the amount of stupid meta comments that aren't funny whatsoever.
And you were right. My dad has taught me to be a beta, so I'm working on power moves. This morning, I left my bowl in the sink.
Damn.
And even though I have done nothing but shit on this show, I will say there is at least one thing here that makes it not entirely intolerable. One thing I can actually say is pretty good, and I'm not afraid to say that I actually like. The animation and style in this show is actually pretty good. Besides all of the other godforsaken stuff I've talked about, the show is very nice to look at. The whole thing looks as if it were taken from the pages of a cartoonish graphic novel, which I thought looked interesting and unique. On top of the fact that animation can get really detailed with lighting and at certain points have entirely different looking art styles. In general, no characters looked awful. Like, all the designs are actually pretty decent and look like humans and not North American cryptids. Hell, I'm actually grateful that at the very least, the animation clearly has effort put into it, because if it didn't, I would basically be throwing it into the pile of those other shows that are basically just Family Guy ripoffs that are lazy as fuck. Hell, the animators go that extra mile and make everything pop in one way or another. I mean, I may not like what's going on in the show, but at the very least, it looks good. The effort that went into the animation is easy to see and appreciate. I just wish the writing were as good. Velma is a terrible show. There's no two ways about it. It's a show that's trying to imitate other, more successful ones, but without the effort. It's a show that wants to have some kind of suspenseful and interesting mystery for the characters to solve that is neither interesting or mysterious and ends up not being very satisfying. It's a show that's not funny, thinking that insults and being meta are what make up a good comedy, when that's not the case whatsoever. It's a show that doesn't know its own identity, not making it clear what kind of audience it wants to have. I am glad this show is getting the amount of backlash it's been receiving, because shows like this are what continuously perpetuate the idiotic notion that adult animation is just stuff like modern Family Guy or Rick and Morty, and nothing else. Because there's so much better animated stuff than that, with terrific examples being like Primal, Inside Job, or Smiling Friends.
I love kids, Charlie! I love kids!
Pim, I would really not be screaming that at the top of your lungs.
I know it's already been reported that Velma has been greenlit for a second season, and as disturbing as that is, if season 2 actually does come to fruition, I really don't think there's any way to salvage.
He called the program the Special Covert Operations Brain Initiative, or Scooby.
Scooby? And wait, what did Scooby do?
That. This isn't like some shows where the first season is a little rough around the edges, but still has the potential to become insanely good. This is just painful. But with all that being said, I have nothing else to say about the show. And if season 2 does come out, I'm really going to contemplate making a video on it. I could barely stand one season of this, and going through all of that again, but now with meta jokes poking at the fact that it was trashed by everyone, makes me nauseous. So without anything more to add, Velma for me gets a 2 out of 10.